Okay, well, SPUC, thank you so much for having me. It's such a privilege to be here with you today and being able to share some of my story and the lessons I've learned. I remember I was 15 at the time, and I was sitting in my first pro-life conference, in quite a similar position to you yourselves, and I was asked this question: who inspires you? Who inspires you? Well, I'd like to tell you a story about a group of people who really inspire me, and they are the Freedom Riders. And these were a small group of young civil rights activists who took part in the Freedom Rides in the deep south of America. And basically, they set out to directly and non-violently challenge racism, segregation, and discrimination. In this time, black people couldn't vote, they didn't have the same rights as white people, they didn't have equal education opportunities, they couldn't eat at the same restaurants or use the same washroom facilities. There was total lack of integration, and they were completely segregated. So what this small group of civil rights activists decided to do was to drive these buses, sit where they wanted to on these buses, into very highly racist and segregated towns. And they decided to go into those towns and sit where they wanted to as well, at the white lunch counters. They knew the price was heavy to do this, but they decided they had to do it anyway. 3 days into their campaign, this happened. They were bombed. They were gassed. They were beaten. And they were hospitalized, many of them. And it looked like the tour had come to an end. That was until a small group of students studying at Nashville University heard about these violent attacks, and they decided, we can't allow this to happen. We need to step up and take over the tour. Many of them had sacrificed, their parents had sacrificed a lot for their education, and they were willing to count the cost and give up their education in their final exams to take on this tour. And one of these Freedom Riders, John Lewis, said, "I know that an education is important, and I hope to get one, but at this time, human dignity is the most important thing in my life." One of these Freedom Riders was a white civil rights activist. And as their bus drew into this town in Alabama, there were over 200 people ready with chains, bats, pitchforks, ready to attack anyone who got off that bus. And Jim Zwerg, who wasn't the victim, said, "Let me go first." He got off the bus. He was beaten to a pulp, dropped on his head repeatedly, to the point where his teeth were literally falling out of his mouth. But because of his bravery and willingness, wrong one. Sorry. Do you mind skipping to the Jim Zwerg image? Sorry about this. And his willingness to count the cost, basically, you'll see in a second. And his willingness to count the cost, an image was taken of him, which showed him completely bloodied, and it spread like wildfire across the country. And it inspired many people to take a stand until finally the laws were changed and policy was changed. Now, why I wanted to share with you this story was that these people were willing to count the cost, to lay down their education. They were willing to confront the culture and be persecuted. And so what I want to do is inspire you today with this talk in the short time I have with you and ask you the question, are you willing to count the cost? Are you willing to confront the culture? And are you willing to accept the persecution that will come with that? So I'm going to be sharing with you my journey into pro-life activism and how God led me on this journey into confronting the culture. I want to share with you the way that God taught me what it means to count the cost for the sake of the unborn. I then want to share with you why it is so important that we understand who our enemy is so that we can overcome this evil. So we need to understand the history of social reform, how slavery was abolished, how African Americans won civil rights. And finally, I want to encourage you that this is a winnable battle if we're willing to count the cost, confront the culture, and accept the persecution that comes with it. Is it working? I hope so. 1 second. Okay. Sorry. Okay, there is going to be an amazing picture that comes up of my family soon. And so I'm the second oldest of 8 children, a large Christian family. And I've been blessed with an incredible example of parents who actually paved the way for me to do pro-life work. And they already counted the cost. So my father, when he was in his mid-20s, he was first confronted with the reality of abortion when he saw an image of it was actually a bin bag full of dead babies. And the title on this image was An Average Day in a Canadian Teaching Hospital. And he saw this and he was like, what do I do? I need to do something. I can't do nothing about this. So he did what he knew how to do, and he went to our local abortion clinic and he just stood there. And he made a little sign and just stood there and prayed. And as a result, obviously he was persecuted for it, but he just decided to stand there. And my mother, on the other hand, she really faced opposition in the workplace. So she was a pharmacist, and one day when she was handing out a contraception over the counter, she realised that this contraception, the IUD, had abortifacient qualities. And actually, if she gave this to someone, she could be an accomplice in the death of an innocent human being. But at this time, this is how pharmacies make their money. It's through these contraceptions. And so she went to her manager and said, look, I can't supply these drugs and I can't supply these abortifacient contraceptions. And he said, all right, you don't have to, but your sales cannot go down. If they do, you have to supply them. That's my family. Yeah, we're looking very happy. And as a result, she got with her friends and they prayed together and said, Lord, please increase the sales. And you see the dot there? They increased exponentially by something like over 100% in the space of 2.5 years. So I didn't really realise the kind of price that my parents had paid. My mum faced persecution every day because there were women coming in saying, why aren't you giving me these drugs? And she was like, I can't actually in good conscience give them to you. And she'd have to just leave that there. But as a result, God blessed her business. So I wasn't really aware of this when I went to my first pro-life presentation, 15 at the time, and this beautiful lady got up to speak, and her name was Stephanie Gray. And everything she said just gripped my heart and made me realize I needed to do something about this injustice. There is definitely an issue with this. And the most powerful thing that she shared with us in that talk was a video which I'm going to share with you now. And it was a video which showed what happened in the abortion procedure itself. I believe that it's so important as pro-lifers that we truly understand the victim's story and see it as it happened. We can't truly be able to defend them unless we know what they went through. And that's why I want to share it with you today. It doesn't mean that you have to watch it, but I encourage you to, and allow your hearts to be broken as you see this. And be asking yourself the question, what will I do about this? There's no sound, and what you're going to see is a woman's journey that Mary Stopes used to advertise their services. And it's basically walking through an abortion clinic. And what we've done is inserted the part of that journey that's missing. Okay. In the words of Greg Cunningham, injustice that's invisible inevitably becomes tolerable. But injustice that's made visible becomes intolerable. When I saw this, I felt like 2 roads lay before me. I didn't really know what I was supposed to do. And there was a man called Andy Stevenson, who is the director of CBI UK and Abort 67, and he was just starting this work at the time. And he said, look, this has changed my mind. Maybe it will change others. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go and stand outside the abortion clinic in Brighton, and I'm going to take the walls off the clinic and let people see what's happening inside. Just like a Holocaust War memorial. Let's let them see what's happening. Does anyone want to stand with me? Catherine was 17 at the time and she joined him, and I was like, no, I don't want to, because my college was just opposite the abortion clinic. And that's 2,000 of my peers. And actually it's quite interesting. Abortion clinics tend to be put right bang in the middle of colleges, very close to students. And so I was like, okay, standing there, teachers will walk past and my peers will walk past. But I knew that I had to do it, because if I knew about this and other people didn't, I could be an accomplice in the death of those people. So I started, and it was really hard, and it was cold, and I did not enjoy it, but actually we saw incredible fruit. We saw people turn around from the abortion clinic and not go through with abortions. We saw women change their mind. We saw students change their minds about abortion. And we sadly saw women come up to us and say, oh my gosh, it has ribs, it has hands. The doctors never told me. And if they told me, I would never have done it. I never want to hear those words again. And I remember one boy distinctly, and he was 17 years old, and he stood at a distance and he just stared at the 7-week living embryo that we were showing. And I said to him, what do you think about abortion? And he very tentatively came over and he said, I've just found out that a girl I had a one-night stand with in Manchester is 7 weeks pregnant and she's intending to have an abortion. And I asked him a question, the same one I was asked at the beginning of this presentation. Who inspires you? And he said, my dad does. My dad abandoned me and my mum, and he inspires me never to be like him. And so I said to him, will you abandon your child when they most need you? He took the leaflet, he shook my hand, and he went on with his day. I can only hope that that baby is alive today because of that journey that he made to see a picture. If you would have asked me, do you feel called to pro-life work? I would have said, no, I do not. Who wants to stand with images like that and show that reality? And actually, when I was about 18, I was pretty much ready to quit. And I went to a Christian conference and I was like, Lord, I'm ready for new direction, or a real direction, a real call. Something that's quite fun, preferably, and that isn't so costly. And so I went up and I received prayer from a couple of people. They'd never met me before. And this lady looked at me in the eyes and she said, you're going to be working for a social justice organisation, defending the lives of young people. And you're going to be like an Esther in the Bible. I'm sure some of you know the story. And she had to risk her life to go up before the king on behalf of a whole people group. And it cost her her life. She had to be willing to pay that price. And this lady looked at me and said, you're going to need a lot of courage and bravery for what you're going to have to do, and it's going to cost you your life. And I was like, please not abort 67, please not abort 67, because I did not want to be doing that, but it became very clear that that was exactly where the Lord was leading me. But not before he launched me into a pro-life boot camp. And before I knew it, I was jetting off to Florida. I'm not complaining about that, but I was jetting off to Florida and I participated in the Genocide Awareness Project. I really hope this works, yes. And this project goes on to university campuses and has reached over 1 million students in the US. And there has been a dramatic shift in public opinion because of their comparisons between abortion and past genocides. Because if the unborn are human beings, then what greater genocide is there than the killing of 56 million people every year worldwide? It's on our watch. After this, I was like, I'm done, finished, tick that box, done pro-life work. The Lord must have something much more fun for me to do. But before I knew it, I was heading off to Canada, and I was participating in a summer internship program where we learnt how to do the pro-life apologetics, learn about the history of social reform, and put that into action as well. So by this time, I kind of got the hint, came back to the UK and was like, okay, I'll volunteer full-time with CBR UK. And it was at this point that the story of the genocide, the gender selection abortion doctors, happened. Now, if you don't know the story, in 2012, the Daily Telegraph did an undercover investigation into 9 abortion clinics around the country to see if gender selection abortions were happening. Because in 2007, a study was done by some Oxford academics, and they found that in minority communities, there were less girls being born than boys. So the Telegraph did this to test and see if doctors were willing to do gender selection abortions. And they discovered that 2 doctors were willing out of these 9 clinics. The first doctor said, I don't ask questions. You want a termination, you want a termination. The second doctor said, that's like female infanticide, common in third world countries. All right, Dan, you're too young instead. And he used a pre-signed form. So, of course, as you can imagine, this story broke. I was volunteering with CBR UK at the time. We were all outraged, like, okay, right, surely something was going to be done about this. The Crown Prosecution Service looked into this case, and although they said, yes, there is enough evidence to convict both of these doctors, they said it's not in the public's best interest to do so. I'm sure you've been taught about how the acts work, but basically, if you don't have an abortion and it complies within the 1967 Act, you fall directly under the 1861 Offence Against the Persons Act, which says that if you procure a miscarriage or cause an abortion, you can get penal servitude for life. So that's where these 2 doctors would have stood. So when the Crown Prosecution Service was saying it's not in the public's best interest, what they were really saying is it's not in the abortion industry's best interest to prosecute doctors for illegal abortions. So there was talk at home with my family and at my work, and we were like, who's going to take on this case? Someone needs to take on this case. The laws are there to protect lives, and they can only protect if they're enforced. And I was 19, 20 at the time, and I was like, well, I've got nothing to lose, and maybe this is that case that the Lord was talking about, being like an Esther going up before the king on behalf of a people group. And so I was like, okay, I'll do it. I was pretty naive at the time. I thought 3 months, that's it, it's going to be sorted. No, not quite. It was definitely a longer battle than I thought, and it was a 3-year court case. So we did some investigations. We got gynecologists and obstetricians and doctors to look into these cases with the evidence that we had from the Daily Telegraph. They looked into it. They told us the guidelines of the doctors' guidelines when it comes to abortions. They really looked into these cases, and they said, yes, actually, these doctors have broken the law because they haven't acted in good faith. So you can prosecute. And so on that knowledge, we launched the private prosecutions. Met with the Christian Legal Centre, and they said, we will support you as you do this all the way. So we ended up in court, firstly in Manchester and in Birmingham. And the magistrates' court said, yes, there's enough evidence to convict both doctors. Let's move this on to the Crown Court. So there we were. We were sitting in the Crown Court, and I was like, very obvious case. Crown Court judge came in, very disinterested, sat down. What's the case about anyway? I was like, we're in the Crown Court. Surely you should know. So we showed him the videos and said, look, we actually want to apply for all the video footage and all the evidence. We'd already asked the Telegraph and the CPS. Originally, it seemed like they would give us the evidence. They backtracked and said no. It looked like to the Telegraph, actually, that this was more a media stunt than actually the pursuit of justice. So we applied for all the evidence. And as is normal with proceedings, usually the courts would summons it. This judge didn't. At this point, the doctor's lawyers contacted the Crown Prosecution Service and said, can you please take over the case and drop it? And they were like, sure, let's take it over, let's drop it. Ended up back in the Crown Court with the same Crown Court judge, and he said, well, as the case is dropped and as you didn't have all the evidence, you're paying the bills. And he ordered me to pay a £36,000 legal bill. So as is natural, I was like, okay, this is obviously outrageous. The CPS issued another statement saying, we've dropped the cases, even though there is enough evidence to prosecute, because it's not in the public's best interest. So at this point, we went to the High Court. They said, well, we're not allowing you to continue with this prosecution either. And another £11,000 was put on the bill. So that was a £47,000 legal bill. Now, I would like to think that actually, that to me, £47,000, £1 million, the 19-year-old, it's money that you just don't have. So at this point, I was like, okay, what are we going to do about it? I remember sitting with 5 lawyers in front of me and my parents, and they were like, okay, what you can do is you can refuse to pay. If you refuse, that's a jail sentence. Or we can all count the cost as well, and we can carry this together. And we can raise the funds and allow others to participate in this battle against gender selection abortion. What do you want to do? I don't think anyone wants to go to jail. But I was like, oh no, why would I be given this choice? And actually, this was the part where the Lord really hammered on me. He just wanted me to feel the weight of what it was to count the cost. Now, I had suffered with extreme chronic claustrophobia for 6 years, and I lived with it daily. And so to me, the thought of going to jail was like, God, you want me to go to hell? Is this what we're doing? Is this where we're going? And I thought in that moment, Lord, what do you want me to do? And I felt him say, if you cling to your life, you will lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, you will find it. And whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me. I was like, no. Don't want to do that. So I said, oh, okay, that's not quite enough, Lord. I need you to speak more clearly if you want me to go all that way, because I cannot fight this fear alone. That morning I woke up. The next morning I woke up. I had a week to make a decision as to what I was going to do. Take it all the way or raise the money. And I woke up and there on my phone was the scripture. If you're my disciple, you'll pick up your cross and follow me. If you cling to your life, you will lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, you will find it. I was like, I definitely did not see that. I'm going, continuing with the day. I'm not doing this. That evening, my family had been doing a Bible study. And this was day 10 of that Bible study. And I just want to read to you what we were reading because it was quite funny. And the scripture was Matthew 10. It said, but beware, for you will be handed over to the courts, and you will be flogged with whips in the synagogues. You will stand trial before governors and kings because you are my followers. But this will be your opportunity to tell the rulers and other unbelievers about me. And then it goes on to say, if you refuse to take up your cross and follow me, you are not worthy of being my disciple. If you cling to your life, you will lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, you will find it. I was terrified. I still had a couple of days left to make a decision. And I went to work and was like, no, the Lord can't ask this of me. And I said, Lord, do you know what? I will do it, but I will only do it if I experience that supernatural peace to overcome this fear. And at work, they said to me, what are you going to do? And I was like, I haven't decided yet, but the Lord keeps saying this one thing to me. 4 of them looked at each other and said, that's what the whole sermon was on yesterday at church, picking up your cross and following him. And if you cling to your life, you'll lose it. In that instance, I had a supernatural, I can't explain it. I had this peace just come straight through my body, and I was like, I can do it. By his grace, I could do it. I could go all the way, and I'm ready to. To me, this was the ultimate example of God's kindness, that he gave me the opportunity to experience what it really meant to count the cost. And so when it came to it, actually, I will share this last bit with you. That night as I was going to bed, I was, sometimes the Lord speaks to me through my imagination or through pictures. And months previously, as I was going to sleep or just in the dreamlike state, I had this kind of dream. I woke up and I wrote it down and went back to sleep. At this point, I looked at my phone when I just made this decision that I would go all the way. I clicked on this note I'd written 3 months previously. And it was a picture of handcuffs coming down out of heaven and these words on this golden bar which said, tested and faithful. I wanted to tell you this story because you, like me, are going to experience a point in your life where you're going to be asked to count the cost. It might be for the unborn. It might be for something else. But you will have an opportunity to overcome fear. And if I've learned anything, that the greatest opportunities that God gives us in our lives are opportunities to overcome fear, and they are gifts. Many of you know the story. The case took quite a different route. And actually, the Christian Legal Centre and other friends and my parents, they were like, actually, we don't want you to hold this alone. We want to count the cost too and carry this burden with you. And so we did. We ended up back in court. The costs were mildly reduced, and we raised the funds, and they were paid off. And I realised, wow, there are people out there who are willing to count this cost as well. In the eyes of the world, the case may look like a failure. We lost. But that was actually part of the purpose that it served. The case has opened this festering can of worms to the public. It's exposed the corruption within the establishment, that the perpetrators of the injustice got off scot-free, those who were trying to pursue justice were punished, and the victims were totally ignored. the most important lesson I've learned is we're not going to win this unless society really recognizes who the victims are. Unless we as pro-life ambassadors are willing to be like Jim's work, say, let me go first, and be willing to count that cost. This is why I believe it's so important that we truly understand how our enemy operates and how injustices were overcome in the past. So what I'm going to do with you now is I'm going to briefly describe how the abortion industry has worked to cause a genocide this big. And firstly, whenever injustices begin, they start by dehumanizing the victim in their language. I'm sure you know this already. So, for example, let's look at the Holocaust. The Jews were called pigs, rats, animalistic, subhuman terms. Caricatures were made of them to make them look subhuman, very fat, massive noses, stacks of money. Then they were put in pajamas. Their heads were shaved. A star was put on them, and a number was put in their arm. And then they're easier to delete. This is exactly how the abortion industry has worked. They have so dehumanized the unborn child in their language that they refer to them as a clump of cells, a product of conception, a fetus, clinical waste. This is how BPAS describe abortions on their website. An abortion is the termination of a pregnancy. The pregnancy is removed via gentle suction. The pregnancy is removed. There's no reference at all to what that pregnancy or who that pregnancy is. How Ann Furedi describes life in the womb and abortion is the following. For me, the question is not, when does human life begin? Because I think we can agree that the embryo is a human life of sorts. For me, the question is, when does life, or human life, can't quite read it, really begin to matter? When in history have we heard statements like this? When does life really begin to matter? I guess when I say it is, says Hitler. So what does that mean the job of pro-lifers is? The child's been so dehumanized that we must rehumanize them. And this is what you've been taught to do over this weekend, and especially with your language and with images. And then what we must do is expose the reality of abortion. That's the part that the abortion industry survives and thrives on. It needs deception, euphemisms, and lies to continue its work and to deceive men and women into having abortions. So we must break down those lies with the truth. There is no other way. What I want to do now is look at two injustices and at the ways that they were overcome in the past. I'm going to start with the abolition of the slave trade. Do we all recognize this character? If not, why not? Okay, right, I hope so. So anyway, do some research if you haven't. William Wilberforce, so the abolitionist the politician who outlawed, eventually, slavery. Now, what he did is he put petition after petition for many years forward to Parliament. And they just didn't work. He was that lone voice in Parliament crying out against slavery. And they failed, repeatedly. It wasn't until he partnered with a small group called the Clapham sect, and in particular this man, who we don't really know so much about, that word, Thomas Clarkson. As you'll notice with movements, especially the pro-life movement as well, they have these three branches. You've got the pastoral branch, which is the crisis pregnancy centres, the post-abortive care. You've got the political branch, so those like Fiona Bruce in Parliament speaking out against abortion. And then you have the prophetic branch, which is the educational branch. People aren't going to look for the pastoral care and help unless abortion isn't the solution. They're not going to look for the post-abortion help unless they realise that abortion was the cause of their trauma. What do they need? They have to be educated. In the same way, politicians, they can put as many bills forward to Parliament as they want. They're not going to have an impact unless public opinion is on side. So the job of pro-lifers, if we're going to have these branches working effectively, we must strongly educate. We need every branch, but this educational branch is going to be the one that shifts public opinion and eventually shifts policy and makes people look for the alternative. So what Clarkson did was he travelled around the country on horseback for 6 months, exposing slavery. He took with him pictures like this of the slave ship Brooks, with slaves literally stacked like sardines. And he took with him pictures like this of slaves being lynched, and like this, and like this, to rehumanize the slave to the public and expose the brutality of slavery. Slavery was hidden out in the West Indies, completely away from the public's eye, and we reaped the benefits. The tobacco, the sugar, the rum. We didn't see that it was bought on the backs of slaves. We didn't see 1.5 million of them die on the Middle Passage alone in these boats, and then wait death and persecution when they got to the plantations. Thomas Clarkson had to rehumanize these slaves to the public, and these images spread like wildfire throughout pubs and homes, and the abolitionist movement was born, and pressure was put on, and eventually slavery was outlawed, and then there was the total emancipation of slaves. A lesson that we learn is that no social reform has ever ended in justice by covering it up. It has to be exposed. Another movement that I want to highlight now is the civil rights movement. King had an issue. Martin Luther King had an issue. We're on first name. Anyway, yeah, King had an issue. This injustice of black people not being able to vote, or of them receiving equal education opportunities, people couldn't really see that. How could he expose this injustice and really show it to the public and make them take note? How could he win that mucky middle, which weren't doing anything about the injustice, those good-hearted white people who were sitting on the fence? He needed to push them off their seats and get them active if he was going to win civil rights. And so what he decided to do, he said, we need to come up with an image which becomes emblematic and symbolic of this injustice. We're going to pick a very racist town and we're going to march. We're going to be denied a permit, but we will march anyway. And we know that when we will march, the sheriff will come out, he'll bring out the dogs, the clubs, the bats, and it's going to be a mess. We'll invite the media, they will take pictures of this injustice, and they will spread, and they will reach people's hearts and motivate action, and policy will be changed. That was his plan. So they chose Albany, Georgia, but King made a mistake. Laurie Pritchett was a polite racist. And so, yes, he did arrest King and the other civil rights activists, but very politely. He just put them in handcuffs, put them in they called them the paddy wagon, and took them off to jail. Media came, but didn't take any pictures. They're like, oh, no interest here. Why? No conflict. So next time, King was thinking, how am I going to do this? Well, we need to choose an even worse town. Someone who's really known for being an absolute brute. They chose Birmingham with a man named Bull Connor, and he earned that title. And he was a brute. And he fell right into King's trap. And he came out with the dogs, and he came out with the bats. And it was a mess. If anyone tried to put down their cameras, they were rebuked, said, you don't. You pick up your cameras, you capture these images, because these images are going to shift people's hearts and end this injustice. And that's exactly what happened. After many years of saturating the culture with the truth, showing a mirror to the American people, shaming America before the world, civil rights were finally won, and it forced the president's hand, and policy was eventually changed. King was incredibly skillful at using conflict. Christians tend to have a tendency to think, oh, persecution, conflict, no, stay away from that, we don't like that. But actually, that is the only way that we're going to be able to shift public opinion. And I don't mean it in like a gratuitous way. They were non-violent. Their position was completely non-violent. They just marched. But it worked to expose a tension that was already there. King said, like a boil that can never be cured as long as it is covered up, but must be exposed with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light, with all the tension its exposure creates. Sorry, I've read that wrong. To the natural medicines of air and light. Injustice must be exposed. With all the tension its exposure creates to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. I hope you can read better than me. So the principles and the lessons that we learn from social reform history are the following. We cannot change public opinion we cannot change policy until we first change public opinion. No social reformer has ever ended an injustice by covering it up. And change rarely occurs unless the cost of maintaining the status quo becomes unbearable. In other words, it's going to have conflict to shift that public opinion. Are we willing to count the cost? Are we willing to confront the culture with a truth that it doesn't want to hear? And are we willing to accept that persecution? I just want to address these 3 points briefly now with you before I end. What does it mean for you to count the cost? For the Freedom Riders, it was their education. The night before they left Nashville, these students all wrote their last will and testaments. They knew that some of them could die, but they were willing to count that cost. What is the cost that you need to count? Is it maybe your reputations? Is it maybe your friendships at university? It is going to be costly to you to stand up for people who have no voice for themselves. Are you willing to do it? The lesson that God taught me is we must be willing to pick up our cross and follow him. And if you cling to your life, you'll lose it. Confronting the culture means sharing a truth that they do not want to hear or see. For me, with the work of Abort67, that means that I go out and I expose it with images. For you, it might mean standing up amongst your university peers and defending and making the case for life. Whatever it is coming to that point and saying, I will confront this evil and I will accept the persecution for it. And what does it mean to accept the persecution? Change will not come without persecution. You don't get change unless there is a battle. And with battle comes fierce opposition, rejection, abuse. But the amazing thing about the kingdom of God is that it kind of works in opposites. We are extremely blessed when we are persecuted. Jesus said, blessed are you when others revile you, persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. And as this, they persecuted the prophets who were before you. How blessed do you want to be? It says you're really blessed when you're persecuted. Are you experiencing persecution right now? For the sake of the unborn? If you're not, you can do. And you'll be blessed for it. And I assure you, when you speak out, you will be persecuted. But great will be your reward in heaven. I want to leave you with the final words of Jim Swerg, who was that white civil rights activist who got off the bus. And he reflects on that time in his life, that exact moment where he had counted the cost, he was confronting the culture, he was accepting the persecution, and this is what happened. He remarks on that period in his life by saying, in that instant, I had the most incredible religious experience of my life. I felt a presence with me, a peace, a calmness. It was just like I was surrounded by kindness and love. I knew in that instant, whether I lived or died, I would be okay. As I draw my presentation to a close, I want to ask you the same question I was asked at my very first presentation. Who inspires you? Become the people who inspire you. Count the cost, confront the culture, accept the persecution. And if you do this, and others do it, we will see an end to abortion.
thank you so much. You're definitely someone who inspires me, and I'm sure everyone else would agree here. The work you do, that's just absolutely amazing and so courageous. We're going to have 10 minutes of questions, so anyone got some questions to ask?
You can do this, yeah.
Hi Aisling, thank you for a brilliant talk. It was very inspiring. Thank you for sharing your story. One thing that I'd like to, I know it's kind of a bit of a side topic, but on the issue of pharmacists, and yeah, it's a real problem. And there's someone who I know who I'm very close to who is involved in this, they're just expected to hand out contraception and abortifacient and so on, and this person knows that it's wrong, he knows what it can do. Any advice on what to say and how to broach the issue?
I wish my mum was here.
Thank you.
I'm sure there's people in the room who, maybe there are medical people in the room who might be better qualified at answering this than me. What I would say is that for my mum, that was part of the cost that she needed. That was part of the cost for her. And actually, when she made a decision to not supply drugs because they were abortifacient, she was actually blessed for it. But for some people, there will be a persecution for it. And I would say that, so with contraception, I'm not sure if you have heard many talks on this already, but many of the pills have abortifacient qualities because they work in three ways. They thicken cervical mucus, and if that fails, they stop ovulation, and if that fails, they also, is it thin or thicken? I always get this wrong. Either thin or thicken the lining of the womb so that the egg can't implant. Huh? Made thinner, sorry. I've made this mistake before. They thin the lining of the womb. So basically, within the contraceptions, they have the capacity to cause an abortion. And it's in much more of these than we realise. You can actually, I think, the Christian Medical Centre have a whole booklet on all these kinds of contraceptions, and you can actually access that online. So the question is, if these aren't just contraceptions, but if they are poisons that could potentially take the life of an innocent human being, do we give them? And I guess that is a question that pharmacists will have to ask themselves. Nurses are going to be faced with this as well, midwives. And I think that this is going to call for people to confront the culture and call for people to start making a stand against this, speaking out and using the conscience clause. I think that others in the room, maybe, is there any medical people here? Anyway, I can't really answer more than that. It goes beyond my remit. Brilliant. Okay, literature over there. Sorry about that. Okay. Yes. Okay. Get back.
I was wondering, I found it quite interesting that you talked about Tom Stark and how he used the images of black slavery to change people's opinions. And I was wondering how, in your opinion, how effective do you think showing pictures of, or images of, abortions to the public is, because obviously they're very graphic, quite powerful, very disturbing.
Yeah.
So is there a right and wrong time to use them?
Yeah.
That's my question.
Okay. So there's quite a broad area to use this. So the main thing that we want to do is, in order to change how people behave, we need to change how they feel about something. Actually, I have a couple of slides on these. So, for example, David Cameron, I think I have this slide. In 2015, he made a public statement saying that we can't take any more refugees as it's not the answer to problems in the war-torn Middle East. He issued this statement. 24 hours passed and he completely makes a U-turn and opens the doors to thousands of refugees. What caused his drastic change in behaviour? The image of a dead Syrian baby. Cameron saw this and he said that he was deeply moved, and so he changed policy. This next image is graphic as well. In the same way, they use campaigns like this to stop smoking. Why do they use these images? Because they save lives. The intent is always to save lives. So when I go out, it's not because I like showing pictures of abortion and I really want I love doing this job. It's because the abortion industry survives on the very fact that this is hidden. And so because if there was no fruit, I would say, don't do it. I'm not interested in doing this. But I've seen far too much fruit by using them than I've seen far much more fruit with using them than I have without using them. Also, I want to just quickly say this one thing. People have come to us and said, well, what about women who've had abortions? Seeing these images, isn't it heartless of you? Aren't you causing them trauma by showing these images? And an analogy I found very useful when addressing this is, from Stephanie Gray. I love this woman. So she says, she had a woman actually come up to her and say this, I've had an abortion. Why are you showing me this? And she said, okay, I've got this water in my hand. I don't know that there's poison in the water. Imagine there's poison in the water. I drink the water and I die. Have I knowingly committed suicide? No. Now let's say you're standing here. You know there's poison in the water. I don't know there's poison in the water. I drink the water. You don't stop me. And I die. Have you been an accomplice in my murder? Yes, because you knew and you didn't say. In the same way, if we know that abortion kills children and other women don't know because they've been told it's a gentle suction, it's an embryo, it's a clump of cells, and we don't tell them and we don't show them, we have blood on our hands and we have been an accomplice in the death of an innocent human being. So we have a responsibility to tell the public a truth that they don't know. That's my main point. And also with poverty. Is this a picture of poverty? Yeah. So Comic Relief raised £1 billion just by showing images like these to move people's hearts. So the key there is, in order to change how people behave, we must change how they feel and how people feel about abortion. Every time that they look at a picture, they're reminded that this is actually what abortion is, and it shatters the lies. Does that help a bit? Yeah. Okay. Is there any other questions, or are we going to round up? Okay. Awesome.
Prepare make a good one then, I guess. Yeah. No, sorry. Thank you so much for sharing your testimony with us. It was great. So thank you. Just a question about the so-called kind of doctors that were involved with the case. Where are they now? What are they doing? And is there no hope we can kind of catch them again as such and bring them to justice?
Yeah, I don't know. It was Birmingham and Manchester, but it looks like with this case, I think we're attempting to challenge it further in Europe, and just the way that the DPP has dealt with this case by saying, okay, yes, there's enough evidence, we're going to drop it and we're going to give you the bill. Do you know what I mean? Because that just doesn't actually make any sense within itself. So we made an application to Europe to challenge that, and so we'll see where that goes. But that's it. Okay. All right. Yeah?
Okay, well, thank you very much.